Many of us are familiar with the challenges our friends and family with HIV face, but what's the financial impact of being HIV positive?
You're listening to or watching Queer Money episode number 542, and today we're joined by Dr. Lorraine Dean, who will share the findings from some of her studies on the financial impact of HIV and how PrEP can help more folks reduce the risk of contracting HIV. Dr. Dean is an associate professor of epidemiology at Johns Hopkins University.
Easy for you to say. Now, on with the show.
With no fees or minimums and no overdraft fees, banking with Capital One is the easiest decision in the history of decisions. That's banking reimagined. What's in your wallet? Terms apply. See CapitalOne.com/bank for details. Capital One, N.A., member FDIC. So welcome, Lorraine Dean, to the Queer Money Podcast. This has been a long time coming, and we're very excited to have you.
Thanks so much for having me today. I appreciate it.
For sure. So the reason that we wanted to have you on is because you've done a couple of studies on the effects of HIV and AIDS on the LGBTQ plus community, or men who have sex with men, maybe more specifically, and what some of the consequences of that are, including financial consequences. So to start the discussion, this is something that David and I have realized over our course of the Queer Money podcast and our understanding of the HIV/AIDS crisis during the 80s and 90s, having grown up during that time, was that there seems to have been sort of this Carpe Diem effect adopted by many, mostly gay men from our perspective as we understand it, in that, live for today because tomorrow we will die. In many situations, that actually was the case. And we know of stories where men took out their life insurance policies and had a really good time before they unfortunately passed away. And it seems like that sort of ethos has sort of carried on into today, despite the progress we've made in fighting HIV and AIDS and how much more manageable it has become. With that understanding, I'm curious, at a high level, based on your research, what are your thoughts on that particular theory of ours?
Well, one, I would say it's not just a theory of yours, right? This is something that we also see in the mass media. I think of that movie, it was a couple of years ago. Was it called Last Man Standing, I believe, right? It was kind of about just the same idea, right? It's kind of who's going to be around. But the good news is that there is a lot of life to live after an HIV diagnosis. The treatments have gotten better. We've had a whole campaign called, U equals U, right? Undetectable equals untransmittable. So there's actually a lot of life to live. The flip side to that, and the hard news on the other side of that is that because there is a lot of life to live, people living with HIV are now susceptible to some of the other conditions that we all are as we age. So think about those other conditions, cancers, hair loss, turning into your parents, right? All the things that we read, right? Everyone's now susceptible. But the good news is that longevity is much better than it ever has been. And an HIV diagnosis means that you can live the same length of life that you lived before.
Exactly. And we've done a couple of partnerships with SAGE, and one of the challenges that they've been facing is now we've got these LGBTQ plus people who swore they were going to die when they were younger, did not plan accordingly financially, and now they're in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they don't have the financial security that they wish they would have had. And so one of the reasons why we have the podcast is just try to get the community talking about its finances early and often so that you can start to adapt your finances for the life that you're going to actually have.
And I think that's absolutely appropriate. Like I said, people are going to be living these long lives. You need to be prepared for the full length of life. As long as you're getting the proper treatments and taking care of yourself, right? There's no reason to believe that you won't need those things, that you won't live into a ripe old age just like the rest of us. Yeah.
Right.
Do you mind if I ask, one of the things that we still do see from time to time, and to be honest, oftentimes when we talk about retirement, I hear from, I don't want to say a large percentage, but almost every single time we hear from young people, especially young gay men, saying, "Oh, I don't need to. I shouldn't bother. Don't bother about retirement, or I'm never going to live that long." What would you say to those folks today who are still thinking of this limited lifespan, whether they are HIV positive or not? What would you say to them?
I would say that, well, one, I'd probably start with asking them the question why. What is it that they think is going to happen, right? Is it that they feel like they're going to live their life recklessly and then going to lose their life early. What exactly is going on? But I'd also think to say, it's like, well, but that could be as equally untrue as it is true, right?
Right.
It's also
Right.
possible that even if you do live completely recklessly, that you'll live for a very long time. And why not make sure that that's going to be life to the fullest? Why not have the same fullness of life now that you can have later on in life as well? So, what's the harm in actually planning for later, and
Yeah.
assuming that you will be here later? And then also look at the population. I mean, people are living a very long time, and with all of the advancements in technology and health technology especially, it are only going to grow. So if anything, there's only reason to believe that you will live even longer than maybe you expect that you're living now.
Right. If Keith Richards is still alive with all the shit that he's done in his life, what do you think about your potential to live that long? Now, granted, he's got lots of
Exactly.
money
He has
to
good
take
D. He
care of
must have good
himself.
DNA.
I but
He's been around since the pharaohs.
yeah.
So you're a smart person. That's why we brought you on the show. In 2020, you did a very comprehensive study on gay, bisexual, and men who have sex with men, and who are also living with AIDS and the financial burdens that they are faced with. Can you elaborate on what some of those financial burdens might be, so some of us can maybe weave that into our financial planning?
Sure. So the reality is, if you're living with any sort of chronic long-term condition, you're going to have to think about the additional health needs that you're going to need to meet, right? So that's going to be medication. That's going to also think about the things around those health needs, like transportation, ongoing doctor's visits, co-pays, insurance, and those sorts of things. So in our particular study, though, we were looking at something even more foundational, right? It's kind of, where are people in terms of their income, education, health insurance, and whether or not they were experiencing financial difficulty. And what we found is that when we looked at this, and we actually compared people who were already living with HIV at the time we measured these things to people who were not living with HIV at the time that we measured these things, essentially at the beginning of this cohort study where we were following people over time, and found that gay and bisexual men who have sex with men, or what we say GBMSM, or we can say sexual minority men, they were 12% less likely to be employed, but 6% more likely to have a higher income, 16% more likely to have health insurance, and 9% more likely to have a financial difficulty when you compared people living without HIV. Part of the challenge, though, here was that if you just looked among people who already had been diagnosed with HIV, being employed was associated with less likelihood of actually progressing to AIDS, and substantially. I mean, it was like a 32% reduction in progression to AIDS.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
all that to say, we don't know exactly where people started out, which is part of this, right? Where did
Mhm.
people start out before they were living with HIV or had the HIV diagnosis? And we also didn't necessarily know what exact costs they were facing, but we knew from other studies that after an HIV diagnosis, people can face costs up to $20,000 additional per year. And that's steep for
Oh,
pretty much
wow.
anybody in the US.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I that was one point I was just really shocked by, that you said all the additional costs. I think a lot of people just think about treatment and medication, but like you said, all those additional costs really, really add up. And as you mentioned, whether you're making $20,000 a year or $220,000 a year, $20,000 is a significant chunk of money to anyone.
In the health economics world, which I somewhat dabble in, I'm not a health economist, but I do dabble in their work. We call them financial costs and then non financial costs. So also think about time and opportunity
Yeah.
costs, which are not even measured here. Think about the time you might
Right.
have to take off of work to go to doctor's visits, or the job that you couldn't take because your care was centered in a place that you really wanted to stay, right? Those sorts of
Right.
things. So I would say, even though we measured a couple of the foundational things associated with cost and people's socioeconomic position, we're probably even underestimating a potential health shock that an HIV diagnosis could have. But again, it's not completely bleak, right? I mean,
Right.
there are things that we can do, there are resources available, but I think we also have to name this as a problem if we want to address it.
Yeah.
Sure.
I want to go back to, thank you very much for all of that. I want to go back to another point that you made, which was a little interesting to me. You basically said that for folks who are living with HIV who are employed, that those individuals are less likely, I think you said 32% less likely to progress into having AIDS. Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Why do you think that's the case?
The mission of Queer Money is to financially empower the LGBTQ plus community. Join us in thanking Capital One for supporting that mission.
So, well, one, I think that employment also is a proxy for stabilizing some other things, right? So, for example, stabilizing people's health insurance, right? Making sure you have consistent health insurance. And the vast majority of people in the US get health insurance through their jobs. So I think that's
Right.
probably one of the most direct things. But it could also be, right, that people who are people who have an employment status also just have other types of supports around them to make sure that they're healthy, that they're staying healthy, right? Maybe they have coworkers, maybe they have kind of a level of social capital and social cohesion. Those are things we couldn't measure in this study, but I imagine there are
Right.
just other things associated with being employed, in addition to health insurance, that help people want to stay healthy, having that work community and those sorts of things.
Gotcha. That makes sense.
You did bring up, or you mentioned, and I don't want to put any judgment around what the word reckless means, but you did talk about, people potentially living a reckless life, health wise. It seems to me like if you have a job, you're probably less likely to take some of those other health risks or live recklessly. Again, no judgment on what that might be, but it does kind of make sense. You think, okay, I've got to get to bed get to bed early because I have work tomorrow, which feeds your body. I can't drink tonight or drink excessively tonight because I don't want to show up to work tomorrow either reeking or still drunk. And there's all those kinds of things that maybe play into that.
That's a great point, right? There might be other, just maybe keeping the job is part of the incentive. So you know that you need to stay healthy for other reasons or just be, but like you said, no judgment, right? I think we
Right.
all do reckless things in our lifetime. I don't think there's a
Right.
class of people who are just reckless, right? We all do things that we shouldn't do and
Uh-huh.
have probably been spared many times for the reckless
Yes.
things that we've done. But right, I mean, maybe employment itself, it just gives that extra incentive to make sure that you are taken care of, right?
Yeah, definitely. There have been plenty of nights where I said, I probably didn't need that second martini
At the
last
school
night.
night.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are plenty of times where we should have said that more often.
Yes.
So one of the other contradictions, at least the way that we saw it, was I think you said that in the study that men who have sex with men, gay, bisexual, or otherwise, who have sex with men and are living with HIV, tended to have a higher rates of having insurance coverage, and if they did have a job, they tend to have higher incomes. Were those two true?
So can you ask the question one more time? Say it one more time.
Sure. I don't know.
Okay.
I didn't ask that very eloquently. One of the contradictions that we thought we saw was that in your study that men who have sex with men and are living with HIV tended to, if they had a job, were typically earning more, or oftentimes earning more per year than those who were living without HIV. And likewise, they also had a greater chance of having insurance coverage. Are those both true? And if so, why do you think both those cases might be separate from each other?
So that's a really, really great question. It's something we puzzled over for a very long time. And honestly, we couldn't completely answer that with the type of data points that we had available, but here's what we think. So when you go back and look at the paper, there are some graphs that show people's income over time. And if you compare people living with HIV to compared to those who are living without HIV, those lines are different. If you look at the two groups in the study, there were two cohorts. The first cohort, actually, people living with HIV do have lower incomes. But the second cohort is where it starts to diverge. So the first cohort, I think they had followed since like 1987 or something like that. And then they brought this other cohort
Yes.
on, which was sometime in the 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
So if I remember correctly, when I went back and checked on this, some of that second cohort was recruited strategically. And I think they were trying to fill in people who were in a different socioeconomic strata than the initial cohort. So some of that could just be an artifact of this second cohort shows up who's just kind of off the charts in terms of their income. And it makes it look like, in general, people have higher incomes. But if we would have just restricted the study to that initial cohort that we were following up for a very long time since the 80s, we actually would have seen lower incomes. And that's consistent with what we already know, that in general, people who have lower incomes are already at higher risk for HIV. And then as we see from our study, after you have a diagnosis of HIV, you might continue on that same trajectory of staying in the low income category.
Gotcha.
One other point to that is, in our case, higher and lower income was stratified at about $10,000. So the people who were lower income were really, really cash strapped.
Right.
And that also partially explains why they might have been more likely to have health insurance too, in some cases,
Yeah.
right? You probably are eligible for things like Medicaid or other sorts of health insurance assistance programs. And especially because there are state level programs, particularly if you have an HIV diagnosis, to help insure you. So some of this might be just a function of this being a cohort study and thinking about how they enrolled people and who was enrolled. But overall, I think what we showed in this study is something that we've known for a very long time, that having a health diagnosis as an economic shock can really, really harms people. And it harms people who were probably already not doing great economically to begin with.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And folks who are listening, the video version of this show on YouTube, we will have some of these charts and graphs that Lori's mentioning to provide some context. So
And we'll link
bounce
to
over there.
We'll link to the study where you can find those in the show notes that we send out in the email.
In this week's newsletter.
Yeah.
Great. So you talked about some of these interventions that help stabilize folks from progressing to AIDS, such as having employment, income, and insurance. Is that basically then I don't know if this is the right word. Is that basically then a prescription for folks? Like if you do get this diagnosis, does that basically kind of provide a sort of a prescription for maybe how you can help fight getting into AIDS beyond just the medications? Are there other interventions that you would also suggest?
So I think there could be a number of things here for different sectors. One is similar to what we are already supposed to have in the US, but honestly, I don't think we know that it works perfectly, is ensuring that a health diagnosis doesn't prevent someone from losing their job, right? Or yes. So, right, that we have protective policies that help make sure people can keep their jobs, even if they have to be out for a little bit of time in order to take care of their health. So one, making sure that we have protective policies and that those policies are truly protective. Because in my work, I do work not just thinking about HIV, but I also do work in cancer. And talking with the people who have a cancer diagnosis, I hear about this all the time. They say, I know that there was supposed to be a policy, but my job found a way, right? So really making sure that people have recourse if their jobs are not properly protecting them. I'd also say some of the other things, you know, I'm going to say it because I'm a public health person, and this is not the opinion of Hopkins or any other entity that funds me, but we need true, actual universal healthcare. Healthcare is a right that everyone in the US should have. It should not be based on employment. And I say this all the time, in a place as resource rich as the United States, people should not have to choose between their health and their pockets. It's outrageous, and we should be ashamed of ourselves. So,
well, that is the money
universal
quote
health,
of this episode right there.
Right. Yeah.
please let it be. Please let it be. If there's one message that I can say in pretty much every single study that I've done, I've found this to be true. So universal healthcare, absolutely. And then, you know, there are other things that are cropping up. So I also work on some of the guaranteed income initiatives. Have you heard about those happening across the US?
You're talking about universal healthcare, or I'm sorry, universal basic income, and also or versions of that they're doing tests around the country.
Yep. So I would say it's a
Yeah.
version of basic income, but guaranteed income is a little bit different because guaranteed income is generally is equity focused. That is, rather than giving everybody money, it's thinking about a subsection of people who really need the additional support. So guaranteed income initiatives could be something else. Maybe there could be a guaranteed income for people living with HIV, right? So then you're not necessarily, if you did lose that job and if that job wasn't protected, at least you would still have financial resources coming in that would enable you to focus on your health. Being able to focus on your health, I think, is a luxury and it's a privilege, because that means that you're not thinking about your basic needs, right? Your transportation, a roof over your head, the food on your table, right? If you can just think about how healthy or not healthy you are, you're doing well, right? So we really need to think about those folks who can't even focus on their health because they're just too busy trying to make it day by day.
Yeah, I mean, we could go down so many rabbit holes with those two comments. But what I'd love to get your perspective on is, as a researcher, as a scientist, and not a policy maker, what do you see as the inhibition for the country to adopt universal health care?
That is a lot of questions. That is a lot of question in one question.
Yeah.
So I think the biggest thing is really valuing that everybody deserves a right to health. And I actually take it back to, and just bear with me here in case this is not where you expected it to go. But I actually chalk this up in part to structural racism. If you think about the slave system that we had in the United States, it was hundreds of years of free labor. And it was free labor where people were treated as expendable. And in general, their healthcare wasn't taken care of, right? There was no need for healthcare. I think today, a lot of that legacy still plays out in terms of the US workforce. People are seen as expendable, and their health is only important to the extent that they can work and produce.
Right.
That's something that affects everybody, not just people who have a legacy of slavery in their background, but it affects everyone. And I think that both of those things still exert influence on the belief system that we have in the US around healthcare, and just not feeling that everybody is deserving of healthcare, regardless of whether or not they are quote unquote productive in society. You didn't expect me to go there, did you?
No,
Not necessarily, but I welcome it because we haven't heard that perspective, and it's definitely something for us to think about.
well, and I also think it really ties into this idea of ageism in the workforce as well, right? We know that as we get older, our healthcare costs go up. And for many companies, many large companies, they're self-insured, right? They have a large enough pool of people that they're collecting money from on a regular basis that they can, in some ways, self-insure. We used to work for a large financial services company that's what was the case, was we were self-insured. And when they know that their workforce is going to cost them more and more and more, they're more and more incentivized to say, let's figure out how we can get rid of these individuals who are 55, 60, 65 and older, because we don't want to have to pay for those kinds of healthcare costs, which again speaks back to this idea that we're all just treated as workhorses, and when the time comes, we take the horse out to the field and shoot it, right? And that's kind of what you're saying is kind of been this legacy that is continuing to happen in our culture.
And I mean, what is the point of health insurance, right? Is it the point of health insurance that we pay up front and then we spend it out when we need it later? I mean, I don't understand. It seems like this is exactly what you're made to do, and then you create a system where you actually can't do exactly what you're supposed to be doing.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
I have kind of this I think is kind of an odd question, in part because when I was a baby gay in my 20s,
Many
many
moons ago.
I did a lot of work with the local AIDS Walk program, and helping run that program. And one of the things that I did see, and I think this speaks to the fact that how much healthcare has changed, but there were a lot of individuals who were diagnosed with HIV, and almost immediately they quit their jobs and went on Social Security disability income. And granted, I think that there were a lot of people who the disease progressed rather quickly and they needed that. But now that people have so many, there's been so many advancements in medical care, do you think that it would be worthwhile for some individuals to think about now trying to go back into the workforce so that they can take advantage of some of the things that you had mentioned, that now you're back into this place where you're working regularly, you have healthcare through your employer. You have all these different things, or should they stay on? I think I know it's a case by case basis, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, if you look at the general population surveys, most people want to be working. So I think if they want to work, they should be able to work. And also, Social Security disability insurance doesn't pay so much. It's not like people are living wealthy, right, off of
Right,
these
right.
roles. So I think if people, if they can, they should. But I also don't want to act like people should only be valued because they do or do not work either,
Right.
right?
Right.
There
Right.
might be other reasons why they aren't working or are not in the workforce. It could be other health reasons, it could be other family reasons. But I would say, I mean, no, they don't have to feel like I would say shouldn't have to feel like they're relegated to SSDI,
Right.
right?
Right.
That they should be able to work, you know, jobs just like everyone else, and they actually might do better in terms of some of their outcomes, as the study suggests.
Yeah. The reason I bring that up is because, as we've mentioned on the podcast, folks, the number one question that we get is, I'm 50, 55, 60 years old. I haven't saved any money for retirement. What can I do now? And for folks who are living on SSDI, Social Security Disability Income, you can save a maximum of $2,000 in any sort of account. That's what you can save, unless you have. There are also ABLE accounts. ABLE accounts is a specific savings account, but I think the max in those accounts, I think, is $200,000. And so you see these individuals who they may want to retire or be at that age to want to prepare for retirement, and they just simply don't have the ability to earn that kind of money because they're still on Social Security disability income.
Yeah, it's really challenging in the US system. It really is.
Right.
Right? You would think that any sort of saving would be incentivized, but I also understand that the reason is because people don't trust that people will properly use the social safety net appropriately, right? They think,
Right.
oh, people are going to take this social safety net money and they're going to hoard it, and then they're going to save it up for retirement. They're going to do this XYZ. So some of this is about just kind of the social trust that we have in our systems in the US. But again, I really do believe that most people do want to work. And I think that especially when people are thinking about older adults, a lot of older adults feel like they can't work because of ageism, right? I hear people saying, who's going to hire me at this age? Technology has advanced so much that who's going to hire me? So I don't know if it's just going to be as easy as walking out and getting hired. It
Right.
might be that we need to also think about some retraining programs for older adults who do want to re-enter the workforce, or special programs for them, just like we've done for many other populations. We did that as women re-entered the workforce and those sorts of things. We could have re-entry programs that are specifically for people who are older adults as well. Not that
Yeah, I
50th makes
think
you an older adult, but 50 is not that
I
old, I promise.
I appreciate it. We had labor economist Teresa Ghilarducci on the show a couple months back, and she talked about her Gray New Deal, and I think part of that includes providing older people the resources to be able to continue to work in the workforce in a job that's more aligned with what they've always done, as opposed to forcing people to sort of quit or retire and then having to go work, in retail or at a coffee shop or at a Target or
Walmart reader.
which is what now people are doing because their Social
Yeah.
Security isn't covering their expenses. So I think we need to have a broader discussion about that. Maybe you and Teresa should go to Congress and talk about a better plan for the U.S. system.
We need it. We need it.
So in general population, roughly about 12% make under $10,000. And the LGBTQ plus community, roughly 23% of the LGBTQ plus community lives below the poverty line. Yet we noticed in your study that about 42.3% of the participants earned less than $10,000. How might that have affected the results of your study, and how should people respond to make sure it applies appropriately? We apply this study appropriately to our lives.
So that's a great point. And as you said, if you look at populations mostly affected by HIV, people with lower economic security are already more susceptible to being diagnosed with HIV. So in some ways, my sample actually does somewhat maybe more accurately reflect something closer to the general population, right? So, like you said, that 23% is double that 12%, but 43% is really a lot. And I would say that's largely because of the way that this cohort was sampled. But I think it also gives us an important lesson to think about equity, right? Is that maybe as we're thinking about this, we really need to be focused on people who are struggling the most. And maybe that's where we need the most evidence because those are the folks who need the most help. We also know that some of the reasons that people who are living with HIV tend to start out in lower incomes even before diagnosis is some of the causes of their HIV diagnosis, right? So injection drug use or sometimes sex work, things like that. But then
Yeah.
also things like lack of access to preventive care and food access and housing instability. So I would say on one hand, yes, that you are absolutely right. There's an oversample in this study, and in some ways that might um, lead to an overstatement of the results. But I also think it gives us an opportunity to think about what happens if we do focus on the people who very much need it the most and what's really happening with them.
Yeah, it's interesting when we were reading this study, and I saw that $10,000 number and the uh, large sample of individuals who were earning less than $10,000. It kind of brought back to my mind that I think that it's either ten or $12,000 is the average income for a trans woman of color, and a
Hmm.
lot of that is because they are sex workers, because they have struggled so hard to get other types of jobs, and this is the easiest way for them to earn some money, and then they get trapped there. It's very hard to get out of that in and move into a career progression that might be a higher earning. And that's like you said, that you're basically staying in an environment where you're higher. It's much more likely that you would be in contact with other individuals who are HIV positive.
Hmm. Hmm. And it's not even just at the individual level, right? We know that people tend to live in areas that are also socioeconomically stressed. So if you've ever seen the AIDS View site, they have some maps that show that, some of this is even at the county level poverties or so county level poverty and county level median income. All of those things are associated with higher HIV diagnosis. And I even wonder about things like even someone's ability to move, right?
Yeah.
In many parts of the country, sad to say, people can't even be out, right? There are still parts of the country
Yes.
where people cannot be themselves and cannot live, as they were created. And and I feel like, right, even the inability to move out to be in a place where you can fully be yourself, right, then leads to riskier behaviors because right now you're doing things closeted, now you're doing things in a way that
Mhm.
where you're trying to hide from people, and you might not be able to be in the healthiest space or do things in the most health protective way. So
Yeah.
it's so much more complicated than just saying income, right? Because it's all of the things that this higher or lower income entails, even in terms of where you're located geographically.
Yeah. I can't remember I'm going to forget this video that we watched that basically overlaid map after map after map, economic map, and it showed basically the migration of African Americans out of the
Hmm.
South. And there were these bands of just where the African American community had settled. And then you see all of these economic overlays on top of that. Do you remember this? Do you remember
I
this
think it was
video?
PBS NewsHour for some reason.
Yeah,
It was
we'll have to find this and link to it in the show notes, folks. But it was very interesting to see how slavery, even though it technically ended hundreds of years ago, we are still feeling the economic impacts of it today in so many ways in America. And I think that that's kind of one of the points that John and I really wanted to ask you, and I think maybe you've already kind of proven this, is that if we had better income equity in this country, do you think that we would see then a reduced risk of exposure to HIV or individuals actually moving from HIV to full-blown AIDS?
Well, one, I just want to just one historical correction. We're actually not hundreds of years out of slavery, right? We're like maybe like 150, if not really
Right. You're
that
right.
far
You're right.
out. And if you actually compare how many years this country had slavery compared to the years that we've been out, it's not that. I mean, this is two generations for some of us, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
When my parents were born, and my parents are not that old, like Black people still didn't even have equal rights to vote, right? I
Right.
mean,
Right.
that legacy is there and it's still new in terms
Yeah.
of human population generation. So, but all that to say, I do think that resolving some of these other challenges, these broad income, and I would say income and wealth inequality, right? If we could address not just income inequality, but also some of these wealth inequality, again, I think that helps stabilize people so that they can focus on taking care of their health. I'm not saying it's going to absolutely cure every
Right.
case or everything, but I do think that if we can get to a basic level of people being able to sustain themselves, a lot of these healthcare needs people will start being able to focus on that they can't right now. Um, but I also think that's coupled with things like health insurance, and right, so
Hmm.
it's not just one. It's going to have to be kind of these multiple systems interacting so that people can actually make the default choices their healthy choice.
Right.
Right. And I, just folks, again, going back to this is that's the whole mission of our podcast is that as a community, we need to start thinking about our own finances, our own wealth, and how that wealth can free us, as you mentioned, be able to move to places where it's okay for us to be out, or move to places where our physical safety isn't in danger, move to places where we can have a life that we feel like we're thriving rather than just surviving, if that.
So curious, how would you like folks to respond to your, what should LGBTQ plus folks, men who have sex with men, and maybe all of us really, because I guess anybody can contract HIV and or AIDS.
Mhm.
How should we respond to this? And then also on top of that, there seemed to be an oversampling of BIPOC people in the study. Should non-Hispanic white men respond any differently at all based on that, or are the responses generally the same?
So this interesting that you say response, because I would not necessarily say that this study calls people to individual action, because if people wanted to have higher incomes, they absolutely would. But if there's anything that they could do about it, they absolutely would. What this should really spur to action is to think about what policies do we need to have in place for these conditions to happen.
Yeah.
Because right, people can't just give themselves employment. They can't just make themselves have themselves more income. And I also don't want people to feel despairing either, right? It's like, oh gosh, one more thing to think about right on top of this diagnosis. So I don't want it taken in that direction. Instead, I think
Sure.
it should really help us think through, who do we need to put in office? Got some big elections
Yes.
coming up this year. Who do we need to have
Yes.
in office? I'm not just talking about the big ones. I'm not talking about just POTUS. Who do we need to have in our local elections and our state
Yes.
government officials? Who do we need to have in those places who are going to champion the type of policies to help people, as you'd say, be economically free?
Right.
So I would say in that way. And I say this is especially true. You kind of mentioned, right, there was this oversample and this special influence for people of color, BIPOC people, right? Even more so right. People need to be out thinking about how these policies might influence them, their own people groups, and who's going to really represent their interests well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just say you're preaching to the choir here, but I think especially when we think about states like Mississippi,
Mm-hmm,
Alabama,
mm-hmm,
Louisiana, states where there are significant populations of Black voters or people of color voters who are constantly getting marginalized out of the voting process. That's why it's so important for folks there, especially non-BIPOC people, to be thinking about how this affects everybody else in the state, not just them.
mm-hmm. I mean, this is probably, again, not what you would expect to say out of this study, but it makes me even think about like the gerrymandering cases that have come out recently, right?
Yes.
It's like, we need to address that. Like, we need to
Hmm.
address that because that's
Yeah.
affecting all of us. But they're corralling certain votes in certain places so that they can keep certain people marginalized than others. So
Right.
yeah, there's so much that needs to be done, but I would say the individual call to action here is really talk to the people and vote in the right people.
Yeah, we've lived in since the the Affordable Care Act. We've lived in Colorado, Nevada, Pennsylvania, and now Ohio, and it's striking how disparate the quality of healthcare is in each of those states. In Ohio, it is horrible. At least for those who are sort of in that nebulous space where we don't earn a lot of money, where it makes the cost of healthcare a non-issue, and we don't earn too little money where we can't get some of the assistance. But it's striking how in each state it's so disparate, and one state it's amazing, and the other state it's a miserable experience. And it shouldn't be that way. We're all in the same country. We're all paying taxes. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a question there. I'm just griping.
I think the same thing. I had a friend who lived in Washington State, who lived in Seattle, and she was telling me that, her massages were covered. Her massages were covered as part of her health care. I was like, get out of here. It's like, are you kidding me? Yeah, I was like, that is not happening for me in Maryland, or for whatever plan I'm on. I'm not getting that treatment. But why not?
No.
Like,
Right.
why shouldn't I? Right? That is part of my wellness.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
I would say, though, there might be one other call to action. And this is an individual call to action. And this is particularly for the group living without HIV, right? Get on PrEP. If you are at risk, get on PrEP. And I think more people need to hear that. I mean, this study was definitely focused on sexual minority men, but PrEP can apply to a lot of other populations, and I think really should be more widely advertised and used. And especially right now, well, not everyone, especially right now, most people in the United States should have $0 access to PrEP.
Yeah.
That's the good news. So, and this has been around for a couple of years, but the United States Preventive Services Task Force gave PrEP an A rating. So plans that are attempting to comply with the Affordable Care Act, those insurance plans should be fully covering PrEP, and it should be $0 for the majority of Americans. But that's being chipped away at. And that's what's kind of a little bit scary about this. So in
Right.
just the last 2 weeks, there was the Braidwood versus Becerra Supreme Court case. No. There was the Braidwood versus Becerra court case out of the Fifth Circuit. That's what it was. And they actually ruled in favor of a couple of companies who decided they didn't want to specifically cover PrEP. At first, it was about religious rights, right? They said, we don't want to cover things that, where people might be, having extramarital sex or something like that. But I believe that was actually thrown out. And then they came back and kind of essentially challenged the authority of the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force to actually make these rulings. So they kind of found another way to chip away at it. However, what the courts decided was that the exemption only applied to the people in the court case. So it only applied to those couple of companies who were involved in the court case. But it also sets precedent for future employers to pull out of doing things like making sure PrEP is $0.
Was Hobby Lobby one of those companies?
You would think, right? You would
Because
really think.
Or they will be
that
soon.
asshole who
Right.
is the CEO of that company or the owner of that company. He is doing all of these court. He is behind a lot of these court cases. Well, because he funds the what is this Alliance for
That group
Lines
that
Defending Freedom.
Alliance
Yes,
Defending
yeah,
Freedom, ADF. Yeah,
they always
right.
have these noble sounding names, right? And then you
Yes,
find out they're just
exactly.
dirtbags. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, Alliance
But,
Defending Freedom. I want that.
yeah, I'll bet you 100% all those people who work for those companies, the men who work for those companies get their erectile dysfunction treatment for free or at really, really low cost. So
Which is unnatural, because Jesus said you should stop having sex with, because otherwise he would give you an erection.
we're going into the gutter now in this conversation. Sorry.
Well, they always do.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, we've gone to go. Are you so? We did have some questions about PrEP. Are you starting to see? what are your thoughts on the rate of adoption of PrEP? I mean, would you like to see it better? Are you happy with the trend? Are we in the right direction? And are we seeing that people who adopt PrEP, is that addressing some of the financial challenges that those men who have sex with men might have otherwise?
So for your first question, we are going in the right direction in terms of PrEP uptake. I mean, PrEP uptake is increasing just, hand over hand every single year. There's some great, again, maps. I love the folks at AIDS View. There's PrEP View maps that show and charts that show it just upticks every single year. However,
Good.
it's still only a fraction of the people who should be indicated for PrEP. I mean, it's an estimated 1.2 million people are indicated for PrEP, and like just a fraction of people are actually taking PrEP consistently.
Oh, really?
Really?
So it's going up, but it needs to go up, and it could go up a lot more and a lot faster.
Sure.
To your second question, your second question is interesting about whether or not that would be related to, decreased financial costs due to, I guess, averting HIV cases. I
Right.
actually don't know. I actually am not sure who's looked at that. I do know that, I mean, we had a recent study that showed that, no, that study that's probably not a great one to mention. Um, yeah, that won't answer your question. So yeah, I mean, maybe I just haven't seen the studies, but I mean, obviously
Sure.
it's going to avert healthcare cases, which is going to bring costs down and kind of people can avoid
Right.
these economic shocks. But I don't think we know how much. I can't give you a dollar amount, for
Yeah,
example.
yeah. When reading the study, we're like, this should solve some of that problem. But of course, we know without study, we don't actually know. I think this has been super informative, and thank you for sharing all the information that you have from the study and all the wealth of knowledge you've acquired in your research. Related or unrelated, we're asking all of our guests these questions today because of the increased anxiety many of our listeners and viewers are experiencing because of the current tone of the dialogue in our country. What has you feeling positive today? It could be about what we talked about, something completely unrelated.
That's a good question. Um, I mean, I would say it's going back to what I said before. I mean, I love the fact that we were able to make PrEP $0, right? And those things are happening because of people's advocacy and because of things moving forward. And I'm actually really excited just about the activism that I've seen in the last couple of years around health and around people's rights, and really being able to change the tone and change the needle for people. So I'm kind of excited about what I would say is, a dawning of a new era for the way that the US thinks about their value, individual worth. Even I'm laughing at some of these memes that I see about like the soft life. And I was like, okay, I'm not a soft life person. I'm way too neurotic to be a soft life person. but but I appreciate that people are moving away from, my value is tied to my work and my productivity. And I think that's really needed. And so I'm
Yeah.
excited to see this next generation really coming in and saying, there are some things that we just deserve as humans, right? And don't have to be tied to whether or not we're working and all of those things. That also is helping us to put us on par with some other, higher income countries, right, that are ahead of us. Those kind of, Scandinavian countries that are doing way better in terms of health and well-being because they're providing these supports to people. So I think we're moving in that direction. That doesn't mean there's not pushback, but I think it's one of those things, where one step forward, two steps back sometimes, but at least we're progressing forward, and over time we're overall moving forward. Or is it two
So
steps forward and one step back? Which one is it?
That's it. That's it. Two
Ah,
steps
two
forward, one
steps
step
forward and
back.
one back. Gosh,
Otherwise, we're
now I've got
we're-
Paul
I was
Abdul
gonna
in my
say
head.
Yeah.
that math was not mathing.
I love that.
Two steps
So I
forward
kind
and
of
one
lied. I
step
do have
back.
one more question related to the
Okay.
original topic. What happens to your studies? Does anybody in Congress see this, and then do they actually ever get to truly understand it and then respond accordingly in the decisions that they make for the rest of us?
So I'll give you an example from my cancer work and then I'll transition. So I was doing some studies looking at something called lymphedema. Lymphedema is essentially, lymph nodes get removed during the course of cancer treatment, and then it's like the subway stops are removed, and so you kind of get pooling of lymphatic fluid in your body. And insurance coverage was really, really insufficient for people facing lymphedema. And cancer isn't the only reason people get lymphedema, but it was one of the subgroups who were at higher risk of lymphedema. So I did this study looking at people who had experienced lymphedema and look at the long-term economic costs. So it was actually the foundation for this exact study, kind of thinking about people who have a health diagnosis and then what are their trajectories over time. Let's not just look at the first couple of years, but what happens 10, 15 years down the road, and found that there was a significantly higher cost even after you accounted for costs just related to lymphedema, that they still had significantly higher healthcare costs 15 or 20 years down the line. So I had just come out of working in a policy job myself. Before I was in academia, I ran Philadelphia's tobacco control program for a couple of years. So I was used to thinking about, what do policymakers need to hear? Where can this go? So at that point, I sent an educational memo to our state lawmakers to say, here are the findings of this NIH-funded study. It also, if this can help inform your decision making, here's some information you should have. I want to be very clear. It was not lobbying because we weren't, advocating for a specific policy or anything like that. We were providing information. But at the same time, the Lymphedema Treatment Act was actually going through Congress. And after sending that letter, all of the Maryland legislators signed up for the Lymphedema Treatment Act. And within 2 years, the Lymphedema Act passed. Now, that was a workup to, maybe, there are people who have been working on this for 10 years. It's not like my letter magically, made the difference. But I do think it helped, right? It was maybe it was a tipping point for some more people, our local legislators, to sign up for it. So I would also say, relatedly, some of this work that I've done does end up reaching congressional members. And I had a recent study that came out in January that is focused on PrEP. And it was showing that what would happen if we change the cost of PrEP, right? It's $0 right now, but what happens if we lose $0? And part of this was forecasting, what happens if this court case, this Braidwood versus Becerra court case, comes out and decides to strip away $0 PrEP? And what we found that even when you increase the cost of PrEP from $0 to $10, it doubled the rate at which people didn't get their first prescription. And then that led to, anywhere from, I believe it was like 3 to 6 times higher risk of HIV in just the next year alone. Wow. So we created a memo based off of that we are now, again, it's just here are the results of our study. And we mentioned, here are some of the things going on right now in society, right, that might affect whether or not it stays $0 or whether or not it, jumps to some other cost. So we design a memo and then we circulate that, and then they use it how they want to use it. So, I mean, it remains to be seen how this will help, hurt, or change. But at the very least, our responsibility is to get that work out there and then to, equip people with the knowledge so that they can make their informed decisions.
Yeah.
And there's examples of hope.
You can also see my cat is really excited about this. I don't know if you saw him walk across.
He's like, it's
very
my
much
turn
into
for
this.
attention.
Yes.
So to wrap it up, so your cat doesn't get mad, how can our listeners connect with you online if that's available to them, or connect with your research maybe most importantly?
Sure. So I do use an X account still sometimes, formerly known as Twitter. So it's at DRLT Dean, like at Dr. LT Dean, Dr. Lori T. Dean. I also have a website, drdeanlab.com, where sometimes I will post updates. But yeah, I mean, I would say that folks want to follow me on Twitter. They'll see updates every once in a while. I'm not a super big poster, but when I have something coming out that I think is important and worthwhile for people to know, you'll see it up there.
Awesome.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for the work that you're doing. And we're going to continue to watch the work that you're doing and maybe have you back on for more of these very educational sessions.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much for your interest. I appreciate the opportunity to share.
Sure.
Capital One Auto Navigator does more than just auto financing. We're here to help you find a car you love, too. Shop millions of cars from thousands of dealers nationwide. Research your favorite makes and models. Explore dealers near you and more. All on Auto Navigator.
Thank you, Lori, for sharing the important work that you are doing and how our community can help fight the spread of HIV and reduce some of the consequences of those of us with HIV. Thank you to our listeners and viewers for joining us for another episode. Get your Queer Money takeaway and resources mentioned in this episode in this week's newsletter.
Then join us this Thursday for another bonus episode, and next Tuesday when we talk with LinkedIn's career expert, Andrew McCaskill, to share how LGBTQ plus people can better navigate successful careers and how there are some LinkedIn tools that can help us do that. Thank you and have a great week.
Cheers, queers.